Welcome back. Osmiridium. Are we there yet? No. No, we are not, but we are close. It will be happening in this episode. That much I can promise you. Before anything fun like that can happen, though, I have another long-term processing build that I want to get running in the form of lots and lots and lots of infused slate. My juice altar has been woefully neglected as of late, and seeing as juice magic is now an integral part of my production lines, it makes sense to resolve that problem. Juice altar upgrades are kind of an annoying fusion of Thaumcraft and native juice magic crafting mechanics with Gregtech thrown in for flavor, so eventually I'm going to need to upgrade and transfer my Thaumcraft setup as well, but right now I'm fine with just leaving stuff crafting up slowly in the background. The peaceful foliage tech is apparently working quite well, if the death ball of witches in the well is any indication. It does seem to have the unfortunate effect of piddling out witches into the cable run every so often when they clip through the floor, but oh well. 2020 TPS is for losers and rich people. While Slate is sucking up souls in the background, very, very slowly, I need to do something about the death blob of multi-blocks on the second floor of my auto-crafting building. My old machine shop was sized for banks of single-block machines, but trying to crab multis in resulted in a design that sucks enough to support its family with a side gig as a septic pump. So I want to build a new building that is sized appropriately to eventually relocate them to before I get too bogged down in tech crawling. This, of course, requires another building, sized to fit the things, which I'm just going to assume is a given at this point, and we'll stop bringing it up. You can pretty safely assume now that if I am getting any sort of new multi-blocker structure, I'm going to put it in a nicely decorated space. The results of my renovations see me one building and a couple multi-blocks richer. I may or may not get around to moving the old ones at some point, but for now they are fine where they are, so it doesn't much matter. The two new friends you see are a cutting factory and a wire factory. As their name suggests, they cut things and make wire out of things. Duh. More importantly for me, the Cutting Factory multiblock has 2 EV energy hatches in it and is a multiblock, which allows it to process IV tier recipes that normally would need to be run in a clean room. This processing capacity is the last component I needed to make my IV energy hatches, which means Osmiridium is right around the corner. While my blast furnaces start going to town on that, back to altar upgrades. The first upgrade I desperately need is speed. I have a terrible, terrible need for speed. I have basically infinite juice at this point, but the rate at which I can turn that into things is painfully slow. Conveniently, speed runes are super cheap, and with the power of my newly reinstalled for like the 5th time infusion altar, those end up being pretty snappy to craft up and slot in. Probably too snappy, as it turns out, since I'm currently unable to produce enough juice to supply the altar now. And yes, I am aware that infusion can be automated. It's on the list of things to do, it just is not a priority at the moment. That's okay. If you don't have enough goose juice, just juice the goose harder, because that makes sense. This can be accomplished by adding vacuum cleaners to your altar in the form of Runes of Sacrifice, which grant a healthy 12% linear improvement in the amount of juice extracted by the Well of Suffering. 16 suction cups later, and I am now producing roughly 200% more juice for the low, low price of literally nothing. This is a problem, though, because it means my altar isn't processing materials fast enough and I'm right back where I started. Conveniently, speed runes are super cheap, and with the power of my newly reinstalled for like the 5th time infusion altar, those end up being pretty snappy to make and slot in. Of course, this means that I don't have enough juice production, so I better make some more, you get the point. I'm stacking the altar. The reason for this is that I need better tiers of meteors, not immediately, but soon. And for those, I need Runes of the Orb, and while I'm at it, I also want to complete a ritual called the Convocation of the Damned, because that is required for further progression, even if it doesn't really get me all that much right now. More on that later, though, because I do believe that a certain special assembly bill has just finished crafting. Yep, yes it did. My first batch of IV energy hatches is done. Priority upgrade targets are the Alloy Blast Furnace and a couple of my EBS. Because they're limited, because of how the multi-blocks are designed, dumping enough energy into them to upgrade them is kind of tricky, so they are going to get theirs first. I hold off on upgrading all of the EBFs, though, because that would be both prohibitively expensive and also because I just straight up cannot supply enough power to them to have them all running at once. My power production is strictly limited to 16 amps of IV, which is 100% consumed by 4 EBFs running on 4 amps each. there is a very real chance that I'm going to need to upgrade my energy production later. That's a problem for another time, though, because right now having IV EBS means one thing and one thing only. It's Osmiridium time. But Goose, you ask, how will you ever supply the viscos for crafting Icorium gear when your best crafting option is a gold-capped Greatwood scepter? Why, dear viewer? By jamming random crystals into a hole in spacetime to create better wands, of course. Sure, they are disposable, but that just means they're cheap, and disposable wands cost basically nothing to produce at this point, so it really doesn't matter how efficiently I use them or how many of them I need. I've had all of the infusion and crafting items for Icorium armor laid out for something like 5 episodes now, so once I have the Osmiridium and the ingots are crafted, the only work involved is chucking things onto pedestals and clicking the infuse button when it's appropriate. Just like that, the Emperor's new clothes have arrived. That said, I do make a point of disabling the pants. I've had problems in the past with the phantom light blocks they create interfering with random stuff, and I would rather like it if the clap of my gold-clad butt cheeks didn't disable my EPF every time I happened to look at it. This does beg the next question, though, which is what am I going to enchant Awakened Icorium with? This isn't RL craft, so weird enchantment mechanics really aren't a thing, and it turns out that really you don't need a whole lot to cap out the defensive and utility potential of Awakened Icorium. A full set of Protection 5 will max out damage mitigation from enchantments in all categories of enchantment mitigatable damage. A full set of Last Stand 13 will hit the hard cap on the conversion rate of XP to damage absorption, allowing me to tank truly phenomenal amounts of damage. Unbreaking, Feather Falling, Hazmat, and Respiration straight up do nothing because of the passive effects the armor has. Ascent Boost is just straight up a debuff at levels higher than like 2, and Soulbound and Night Vision only need 1 level to do their thing. All this to say, of the entire suite of armor enchantments in the game, there's only like 3 that could benefit from Uber enchanting. Haste for better land speed mobility, Thorns, because it might be funny, and Pounce, which lets me one-hit mobs even harder than I already can. Or something. I opt to go with a nice, moderate, conservative enchantment of Haste 20. When combined with the passive movement speed multiplier from the boots, this results in an entirely predictable result of me turning into a walking ramjet engine, which I consider to be marginally close to an appropriate level of mobility. Because of how haste works, the buff does not apply when I'm flying, which means, weirdly enough, if I want to slow down for fine control, I can just take off and disable the boots to return to vanilla flying speeds. That little side project finally completed, back to the goose juice. The first step for unlocking the Convocation of the Damned is to craft and install 25 runes of the Orb, or, as I found out later, only 13 in this version because in New Horizons they got buffed. But that's fine because altar capacity is just nice to have, and I have plenty of upgrade space. This has the effect of raising the maximum amount of storable energy in my altar from 10 million to 20 million in my case, which is the first requirement for the Convocation, as it requires 15 million to begin. That was the easy part. The next step is setting up the ritual, which requires 2 stacks of ritual stones and a monstrous pile of useless blood alchemy juice stuff, which itself requires another legally distinct mountain range of nonsensical garbage. Why do I need to individually bind quartz rods? This literally just wastes my time. Why exactly do I need to make witchery golden thread, to make juice-soaked string, to make alchemical relays? Witchery is utterly useless, and it's a support mod on top of it. This requirement alone requires people to spend several hours grinding out the fundamentals of an utterly useless and unrewarding tech tree for the sole purpose of making a thematic statement. Even ignoring Gregtech, a great deal of the nitpicking nonsense comes from the juice magic itself, which seems to be struggling to justify the existence of 90% of its content at any given time by demanding it in a pseudo-recursive self-dependent crafting recipe that serves no function other than to time-cape people behind meaningless pixel shuffling. Or maybe I'm just grumpy, because this whole process wasted like 4 hours of my life. Either way, after more than a little bit of aimless flailing in the general direction of progress, I have everything I need to proceed. The Convocation of the Damned is blacklisted in the overworld, because people cannot read the instruction booklets and follow directions, and this is why we cannot have nice things. Because of this, I decided to set it up in the Nether, both because of the thematic implications, and because of the dimensions I have access to. The Nether is basically the most useless and most obnoxious to work with. There are plenty of online guides that explain how this ritual works, so I will only summarize. Because I'm in a void world, I need to make a giant platform. Because I am in the Nether, this results in inconvenient spawning patterns, so I take the time to light it up. Torches aren't going to stop all hostile mobs from spawning, but they do stop nitro creepers and ghasts, both of which have a concerning tendency to just blow things up in a not-so-fun way. With the prep work done, the ritual itself is boring. Make a giant thing of fancy blocks. Add jars of Technicolor fruit punch and spend 20 minutes trying to get them strawed up correctly while being ganked by angry dogs, and another 20 minutes watching them very, very slowly get sucked into the activated ritual. Add a sacrifice altar. Summon, and then sacrifice, an innocent civilian abducted from a different plane of existence while possessing waterfalls of witch juice in your batteries, and voila, random demon portal thing. Demons are durable folk, and despite the tragedy that led to its making, when presented with a sudden dimensional rift in their home network, they will immediately begin colonizing whatever is on the opposite side. Unfortunately for them, I am on the opposite side, and am armed with a healthy collection of soul jars to collect samples, and a sword that does 60 points of damage. So this goes about as well as you would expect. The structures this ritual spawns can sometimes contain dungeon loot chest, which is quite useful for stealing things, and I appropriate some now kind of pointless iridium and a copy of the One Ring. Truthfully, Luniums are a better way of farming dungeon loot, but I'm not going to pass up freebies, and there is a non-zero chance that I might need the One Ring at some point down the line. A while ago, someone, and I'm sorry for forgetting who, also commented that diamond spikes can be used as a weapon. I tested this. It works. Really, really well. Having a looting enchantment 60 times stronger than I should be able to possess turns farming demon crystals from a game of RNG to a game of inventory management. And I am okay with this. It's fun and all, but the fact of the matter is, unless I want to produce a truly flabbergasting amount of Icorium the really, really hard way, I can't proceed until I get an assembly line. So most of this work is not going to bear fruit for a bit. Well, alright, so if I can't push that forward, what can I do? For starters, I can make a better scepter. My most powerful wand crafting ingredient is currently lich bones, which limit me to some pretty lousy wand materials. But the fun part of being the walking embodiment of a Thumbcraftian Akashic Tome is that there are so many different Thumbcraft interactions I can exploit that this straight up does not matter. Single-use crystal wands, because of my endgame gear, have an effective vis crafting cap of 500. Which puts me far above the vis requirements of all but the most expensive wands in the game, and is hilariously over capacity for anything that's crafted with something as mundane as bone as a magical ingredient. Of course, I first have to get the bones, which proves to be marginally complicated given that looting 70 trashes my inventory with like 2 mobs, and looting 180 is even worse. But what can you do? Now that I have the bones, I now have to select my wand materials, which is simple. Icorium wand caps give me the highest cap-based vis discount in the game, and Thaumium wand cores have the highest capacity of any of the materials that I can use with lich bones. Neither of them are terribly complicated to make, though the wand cap and crafting step does use disposable wands to meet the vis requirements, so if you didn't have a rift already and are following along in the run, you kinda need one. This combination of material, combined with a passive 40% vis consumption reduction from the full Awakened Icorium set, grants me a stupidly strong scepter with an effective crafting power somewhere around the same 500 vis that my crystal wands have. But wait, there's more. Thaumic Machina is a weird little add-on that doesn't really do much at all, and 90% of its quests are just lore attempting to explain how Thaumcraft actually works while making allusions to different versions of the mod that came before and after this one. Of the 10% that isn't that, though, there is an absolutely goated branch that allows you to upgrade your wand directly. By applying the increased capacity and decreased vis cost upgrades, my little stupid stick goes from an effective crafting power of 500 to a comical 1153, meaning that I now have more crafting power than any single recipe in the entire game can use. This does result in a scepter that looks suspiciously like an eggplant slathered with radioactive turds, but anyone who knows anything about me will be unsurprised to hear that I am unconcerned by this. All the stalling was enough for my next DDF upgrade to finish in the form of HSSS coils, an abbreviation that I will henceforth refer to as HISS because I cannot be bothered to pronounce that correctly. Technically speaking, HISS is not a required upgrade since you can skip to an aquatic coil directly, but that registers in my mind as the literal definition of pain and suffering, so I always make sure to get it. We are firmly approaching the point where the raw material cost of any one particular thing is inconsequential, and as long as it saves me more time than it costs to make, it's worth. His coils unlock more metals, most notably nitinol 60, though technically I could have made this with an alloy blast smelter and fluid solidified it, but that would have required an IV fluid solidifier, which struck me as wasteful. This lovely metal is the last requirement for me to make something called a large processing factory, which takes the idea of multi-crafting to the next level by having 3 separate modes, with each mode allowing the machine to process the recipes of 3 different single-block machines simultaneously. On Mode 1, it serves as a compressor, lathe, and polarizer. Mode 2 works as a fermenter, fluid extractor, and a regular extractor, and most importantly for me right now, Mode 3 works as a laser engraver, an autoclave, and a fluid solidifier. All 9 of these machines in the multi-block get a substantial energy discount and processing time decrease, have or can have configured some form of context-dependent crafting, and most importantly for me, are treated as if they are being completed inside a clean room, which is especially relevant given that the laser engraver is required for circuit assembly jobs, and this one can be upgraded with energy hatches. Boy are you paying for those perks, though. This thing is, without competition, the single most expensive multi-block in my base. All this wonderful technology is great, but there are some issues associated with it, most notably that the power draw is starting to become less than wonderful, but really, really great again, and particularly high rollers like EBFs have started to lose power when I want to run really huge builds through them. So far, this has only showed up as a problem during the absolute peak demand of my production lines, but it is definitely something that I need to keep an eye out on, because once I start cranking out high-tier recipes and installing more long-term processing systems, brownouts are going to start becoming a thing. I need to deal with this now, so I spent a good while reading up and researching potential solutions, but nothing immediately leapt out to me as objectively superior. Right now, I basically have 2 approaches that I can take, but one of them is just objectively worse than the other. I can either produce more energy, or in the short term, what I can do is just upgrade my energy storage. Energy storage seems like a weak option and is not great because it only helps if you have high peaks and low troughs, which is mostly what is happening, but it does absolutely nothing to account for just the natural rising energy consumption demands of my base, so really all it does is kick the can down the road. Instead, I'd much rather just have the capacity to overproduce a metric turd ball of power and only use 1% of that production capacity at any given time. I could, obviously, just expand the vac nuke setup some more and call it a day, and as I see it, this is probably the most reasonable option. For all my whining about it early on, I've finally got a stable, scalable design that behaves itself pretty well. I would need to cram more energy into the vacuum freezer and make more junk for it, but overall this design is hands down one of the best things to come from this run so far, and I would be more than happy to replicate it again. Add on to the fact that I only need it to last long enough until I can limp along into late Louvre, and this might just be the simplest option. One of my other options at this tier is a liquid thorium reactor. At first glance, it seems to just be a more expensive, less efficient, more engineering demanding multi-block version of what I already have, and second, third, and fifth glances did not change my impression overly. It is an option, and it has some interesting byproducts that I might want later on, but the processing requirements are hellish, and pound for pound, vac nuke setups just straight up produce more power, and until I really get into exotic fuel types at the higher tiers of the LTFR, that's not gonna change. Now that I have the capacity to make large processing factories, benzene is also back on the table, but it still isn't that appealing to me for the same reasons I didn't use it in the first place. Benzene starts having diminishing returns in the next tier or 2, and requires dedicated processing to make it work, which I'm less than thrilled about designing when it is effectively a stopgap measure. This, of course, entirely ignores the question of whether or not I could realistically design a system capable of producing enough charcoal without lagging my game to pieces, but we'll ignore that for now. To give you an idea of just exactly how deeply I dived into energy production, I even gave serious thought to doing something with compressed solar panels. I don't think solar panels of any variety are good in this pack. I don't even think that they are viable, but if any run I do ever has the chance of making them work, it's going to be this one, and my instinct for memes and self-flagellation wanted to go this route very, very badly. My current world is uniquely blessed with an extremely overplumbed automated system, a solid, mostly excess supply of power, and the technology and infrastructure needed to scale all of the low-tier material production I would need is either already present or is super easy to build. I even have the tech to maintain 24/7 sunny days and clear skies, so I wouldn't need to move the solar panels into a more stable dimension. They could just install directly in my base. This was really, really tempting. The problem is that solar panels suck, and I would need to drop somewhere around 50,000 LV tier circuits to make a system that even roughly compares to a vac nuke deathball. And by the time the processing for that build finishes, I'm probably going to have gotten fusion anyway, so this seems like a less than wise plan. As evidenced by all of the crafting I've been doing in the background, I clearly opted to go with making more vac nukes. If it ain't broke, I see no reason to fix it. More vac nukes does present something of a logistical issue, in that my power management relies on using a very large battery buffer to throttle its output. Cheap IV batteries are fine for this, since I don't really care about the storage capacity, but the cheapest ones available to me require quite a lot of cenarium, and breeding reactors are an uncomfortably slow source of this stuff. Instead, I opted for a blast from the past, and tried to breed up some bees capable of producing it. Their jubilance requirements are satisfied by a plains biome, and I have 3 alvearies doing nothing except standing around and eating TPS, so this seems like a decent use for the things. In my haste to modernize my technology base, I kind of forgot about bees, but now that I'm looking at them, they are low-key kind of super broken in a few respects, and cenarium production is definitely one of them. Or I can go back to doing breeder reactors, because it turns out that cenarium bees require a superconducting coil block to breed. Oops. I knew there had to be a reason I wasn't using these things. That's fine. For some strange reason, I seem to have a huge bank of empty nuclear reactors sitting around doing nothing productive. It's kind of curious how these sort of things always work out, isn't it? The cenarium will take a couple hours to process, but there is plenty of other things that I can occupy my time with during that. Like wiring the stupid things up. Because, good grief, does it take a long time to wire all of these stupid things up. I need to upgrade the vacuum freezer to handle the increased coolant demands. The cabling outside needs to be touched up to make sure I don't burn my wires out with 32 amps of power. And because my EBF room is the #1 culprit there, most of that also needs to be dioded to throttle the amperage through the rest of the base. Unless, of course, I want to replace everything with 16 times platinum lines, which is rather expensive. I need new wiring and item conduits slaved to the control of the first reactor system. I have to tweak the design of the fuel supply timing to account for the 2 separate banks of reactors with potentially differing power output levels, and all of this is entirely separate from the wiring work that every new reactor needs to do anything in the first place. Also, despite my best efforts, fuel rod desyncs keep happening between reactors, so I bit the bullet and put in tally boxes on each of the reactors individually and then hooked them all together. They only output a high signal if a reactor needs refueling, which, for better or worse, implicitly ORs the shutdown and resupply request, so whenever a single reactor needs more fuel, it does have the unfortunate effect of shutting down the whole network, which isn't super ideal. But given that uranium fuel rods last for like 5 hours, this only results in a well-buffered 2.5% downtime, which is way less than the time they spend idling, so it should be fine. As expected, the rewiring is done long before the batteries are, so I'm going to be doing a rolling onboarding of the new system, which is a fancy way of saying only enabling reactors when I have batteries for them, by using a very high-tech solution of just don't turn them on, you idiot. The end result of this is that I now have double the power production and can wholly let loose with system upgrades to my heart's content. For a little while. For those who are wondering, this secondary system means that I can now produce a whopping 32 amps of IV power, consuming 1 uranium fuel rod every 83 seconds in the process. Thankfully, I usually don't draw that much, but it is an option if I need it. So, I effectively have twice as much energy to play with. Now what? First things first, I need to put corporate America to shame by actually making good on my promise to reduce pollution output and enact environmental change, because my EBFs are stanky. This can be solved by throwing expensive tungsten steel blocks with added electronic flavoring on top of my EBFs and takes me about 30 seconds. Your turn, stinkers. Second thing second, I was going to start upgrading all of the energy hatches that I have, but a problem came up in the form of chlorine production. Specifically, my complete and utter lack of it. Normally you get this stuff from pumping planets dry or farming saltroot, which is great, but I have no way of getting to other planets and I hate farming. I've been making do with what I can pull from meteor salt, which until recently was good enough, but now that circuit and exotic plastic consumption has gone on the rise, it is not cutting it anymore. Enter gas tiers. When mixed with water, they produce salt water, which can be electrolyzed into sodium hydroxide, chlorine, and hydrogen, and all three are valuable industrial ingredients in their own right. Normally, there's no way to get a stable enough source of bulk gas tiers to have a hope of making this viable, but normally I also don't have looting 180 and an infinite supply of ghasts, so let's not get bogged down in stuffy tradition. Special mobs ghasts are a mob farm designer's worst nightmare. Welcome to Test World 3. By the way, Test World 2 had a sudden and unfortunate incident involving stuff and things and had to take a permanent vacation. Anyway, ghasts. They suck to farm. To start with, they all are infernal. 100% of them. They all fly. They come in sizes ranging from less than a block to nearly 7 blocks wide. They have a special variant that can be only meaningfully damaged by the Smite enchantment, which, when paired with Infernal Regeneration, makes them functionally immortal to anything else. They also have a variant called Feint that clips through any solid blocks, including anything that normally would be used to, kill them. The Smite requirement can be worked around by making a Smite and Wrath spike that is sufficiently uber enchanted, which will take a while, but because it's a spike is not going to be insurmountably annoying. This does nothing to stop the Feint ones, because they clip right through it, and they are the real problem here. I went through a couple variants of farm designs and eventually settled on one that works using mob filtering. Ghasts will be spawned on the spectral glass block using gas tiers and phantasmal bees, and then will be sucked down towards a corporeal attractor, which is basically a magical omnidirectional vacuum for mobs. If they can touch blocks, they will be hit on the uber spike and die. But if they can't, then they will get sucked through the spike until they reach a point where the suction from the attractor starts fighting the repulsion from a thaumic relocator 10 blocks underneath it. The relocator is stronger than the attractor, but its thrust vector only points straight up, which means that it will only fight the downward component of the corporeal attractor, effectively trapping the ghast in the XZ plane and wiggling it around a bit on the Y-axis. This jiggle point is conveniently high enough to be hit by a dynamism tablet with a second spike, or any other appropriate weapon, which kills the Feint ghast by hitting it, rather than having it collide with a block. Obviously, when I build this in the real world, there will be walls and item filtering and stuff, but this is the general idea. Also, for those who are wondering, the mob farm multi-block does not respect looting 180. I tried it. Over-enchanting the spike, as expected, ends up being the fast part. What really takes the time is waiting for my Essentia smelteries to prepare the several thousand Precanto Essentia I need, so I'm able to finish the entire rest of the farm long before I can create the spike. Schrödinger even stops by to help test the mob capture mechanism. Such a helpful kitty. Thank you, Schrödinger. Once that's all in place, I finish up the spike, slap it in, and turn the system on. And immediately realize that something is not working correctly. Joy. Also, why are there creepers in this thing? There should never be any gunpowder exposed to bees. And why is this stupid ghast not dying? That spike has Smite 20 on it. It should touch it and obliterate itself. Safe to say, the first deployment did not go as planned. After going back to the drawing table, two major flaws are identified and resolved. The first was that the tier was not falling close enough to the bees to reliably convert, and because it landed on Spectre Glass, it kept bouncing everywhere, because Spectre Glass is really weird. This is fixed by removing the landing pad of Spectral Glass, shifting it closer to the apiary, and replacing it with a cobweb, which works just as well because items clip through mobs but are caught in the cobweb and slowed down. This does introduce the potential for mob cramming, but in this particular instance I don't really care, because all the mobs are going to be getting equally sucked into the spike anyway. The second problem was that the apiary was close enough to the killing platform to cause runaway reactions if items landed on top of the spike. This is bad, with a capital B, but can be easily fixed by just moving it up a little bit. The real fun begins with item filtering. Existing item filters continue to just be objectively better than their other options, but they do require you to have a sample of the item you want to filter for in a chest. Which means that I need to let the farm run for a bit and collect said samples. This isn't terribly complicated, because it just means I have to crank the mob farm up to its maximum capacity and wait. Oh, speaking of which, the mob farm's maximum capacity is entirely determined by how fast I can extract items, by the way. This sucker has no effective upper limit on its production speed, and I have multiple ways of making it faster. This works great for collecting items, but is less than ideal for sorting them because it means that I have to go through the chests while listening to this. I tried a sound muffler. It didn't work. Yay. This is compounded by the fact that the smite spike is not killing the smite vulnerable ghasts, and I have no idea why. But I don't really care, because at the rate this thing produces stuff, I can just stock up several million of whatever item I want from it and de-render the ghasts in a few minutes. Oh, and my gold problems are solved forever, by the way. Certain ghasts drop gold ingots, and those drops are subject to the looting enchantment on my spike. This is exactly as broken as you think it is. It is honestly to the point where I am concerned that I will overflow my ME system if I leave the farm running too long. As unfathomably annoying as this farm is to live within shouting distance of, there is an upside, in that my chlorine production problem is solved forever. I don't mean that in the snarky way, either. For once, this farm scales as a function of the looting number on the spike, which goes up to the tens of thousands, and the number of mods I can cram into it, which is functionally infinite. One gas tier is one bucket of chlorine, and I can easily get this thing cranking out 1,000 tiers a second. This is endgame level chlorine production, and all it costs is a few frames and my ability to distinguish sounds in the 1500 to 2500 Hz range. Regardless, it is progress, and that is all that I care about. Thank you for your time. All the usual support options are in the usual support option places if you're interested, and I hope you enjoyed.